Jake Martinez stared at the bottom of his empty glass and wondered if he should order another drink. The cantina was loud tonight, filled with voices speaking in dozens of different languages. Alien crew leaders walked between the tables, looking for workers to hire for their ships. Jake had been sitting in the same corner booth for 3 hours, and not one of them had even glanced his way. He knew why. Word traveled fast in the spacer community, and his reputation had spread to every port in this sector. 3 ships had broken down while he worked on them. 3 captains had lost money because of delays. 3 times, Jake Martinez had been labeled as bad luck. Now everyone called him Jinx Jake, and nobody wanted to hire a mechanic who might curse their ship. Jake pulled up his account balance on his wrist display. 47 credits left. Enough for maybe 2 more meals and another night in the cheapest room at the port hotel. After that, he would have to find work or start sleeping in the cargo bays with the other desperate people who haunted the station. A tall woman with short black hair approached his table. She wore a captain's jacket that had seen better days, and her boots were scuffed from walking on metal deck plates. Jake recognized the look. She was a trader, probably running a small cargo ship between the outer colonies. Independent captains like her usually had tight budgets and crews that changed every few months. "You Jake Martinez?" she asked, sliding into the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Depends who's asking," Jake replied, though he already knew this had to be about work. Nobody else talked to him anymore. "Captain Zara Voss? Of the merchant ship Starlight Runner. I hear you're a mechanic." She flagged down a server and ordered 2 beers. "I also hear you're available." Jake almost smiled at that. Available was one way to put it. "What kind of work are you offering?" "My chief engineer quit yesterday. Had a fight with my first officer and walked off. I've got a cargo run to Kepler. Station that leaves tomorrow morning, and I need someone who knows their way around ship systems." She leaned back in her chair. "I know about your reputation, Martinez. But every other mechanic in port is either already hired or won't work with human crews." The server brought their drinks. Jake took a long sip before answering. "What's the pay?" "Half the standard rate for the position," Zara said bluntly. "I'm not going to lie to you. It's not a great deal, but it's work, and it gets you off this station." Jake had hoped for better, but half pay was more than the 0 credits he was making sitting in this cantina. "How long is the run?" 2 weeks there, 2 days loading, 2 weeks back. "If things go well, maybe we can talk about making it permanent." Zara studied his face. "Look, I'm not doing this out of charity. I need a mechanic, and you need work. My ship isn't fancy, but she's solid. Built 20 years ago and still running strong." "What kind of cargo?" Jake asked. "Medical supplies for the outer colonies. Nothing dangerous or illegal." She finished half her beer in one drink. "The job's yours if you want it, but I need an answer now. We launch at 0800 tomorrow." Jake thought about his empty wallet and the dingy hotel room that smelled like cleaning chemicals. He thought about the other spacers who whispered behind his back and the crew leaders who looked right through him. This might be his last chance to get back into space. "I'll take it," he said. Zara nodded and stood up. "Good. Bay 17, Level 3. Be there at 0-7-30 for the crew briefing." She tossed a few credits on the table to pay for the drinks. "And Martinez?" "Whatever happened on those other ships, I don't care. Just keep my engines running." After she left, Jake finished his beer and made his way back to his hotel room. He packed his few belongings into a worn duffel bag. His tools took up most of the space. They were good tools, well maintained and carefully organized. Some of them had belonged to his father, who had also been a ship's engineer before he died. Jake's mother had given them to him when he graduated from technical school. That felt like a lifetime ago now. Back then, Jake had been full of plans and dreams. He was going to work his way up from junior mechanic to chief engineer, maybe even captain his own ship someday. He had studied hard and graduated near the top of his class. His professors had written good recommendations. The future had looked bright. The first ship had been a cargo hauler called the Steady Eddie The captain was an older man named Bill Tucker who gave Jake a chance despite his lack of experience. Everything went fine for the first few weeks. Jake did his job, kept the engines running, and tried to learn from the other crew members. Then the Eddie's main drive had failed during a routine jump between systems. They dropped out of hyperspace in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help and only enough life support for 6 days. Jake had worked around the clock to fix the problem, tearing apart the engine housing and rebuilding half the drive system with spare parts. He got them running again, but it took 4 days. By the time they reached their destination, the cargo was late and the buyers had found another supplier. Captain Tucker lost a lot of money on that run, and word got around that his new mechanic was trouble. The second ship was worse. The navigation computer failed during approach to a station, and they nearly crashed into a cargo platform. Jake managed to jury-rig a backup system using parts from 3 different consoles, but not before they caused a major traffic delay. The port authority fined the ship's captain, and Jake got fired before they even finished unloading. The third ship should have been his last chance to prove himself. Instead, the life support system had a cascading failure that left the crew breathing recycled air for 18 hours while Jake worked to fix it. He succeeded, but by then his reputation was ruined. Word had spread that Jake Martinez was bad luck, a mechanic who brought trouble wherever he went. What none of the stories mentioned was that Jake had actually saved all 3 ships. The problems hadn't been his fault. He had just been the one stuck trying to fix them when everything went wrong. But spacers were a superstitious bunch, and facts didn't matter when credits were on the line. Jake set his alarm for 6 in the morning and tried to get some sleep. Tomorrow would be a new start with a new crew. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe Captain Voss would see past his reputation and judge him by his work instead of his luck. He doubted it, but he had to try. This job might be his last chance to prove that he was more than just a jinx. If he could keep the Starlight Runner's engines humming for one successful cargo run, maybe other captains would start to forget the stories about Jinx Jake Martinez. Outside his window, the station's lights twinkled like stars. Ships arrived and departed at all hours, carrying cargo and passengers between the worlds. Somewhere out there was a future where Jake could be part of that again, where he could do the work he loved without people looking at him like he was cursed. All he had to do was keep one ship running for 4 weeks. How hard could it be? Jake arrived at Bay 17 with 10 minutes to spare. The Starlight Runner was exactly what he expected from an independent trader. She was a medium-sized cargo hauler, built for reliability rather than speed or looks. Her hull showed the scratches and scorch marks that came from years of hard use, but the metal looked solid and the engine housings were properly maintained. Captain Voss was waiting at the bottom of the boarding ramp with 3 other crew members. She pointed to each one as she made introductions. "Pete Collins, my first officer," she said, indicating a man in his 40s with graying hair and suspicious eyes. He shook Jake's hand but said nothing. "Lisa Murphy, junior engineer. She be working with you in the engine room." Lisa was younger than Jake, maybe 25 with red hair tied back in a practical ponytail. She looked him up and down like she was measuring him for a coffin. "And these are our cargo specialists, Krex and Chitara." The alien crew members stood slightly apart from the humans. Krex was a saurian 7 feet tall with green scales and yellow eyes that never seemed to blink. Chitara was smaller, an insectoid vex with 4 arms and compound eyes that reflected light like jewels. Both aliens nodded politely but kept their distance. "Questions?" Captain Voss asked. Jake had plenty of questions, but he knew better than to ask them on his first day. "When do we launch?" 1 hour. Murphy will show you to your quarters and then take you on a tour of the engine systems. We're carrying medical supplies to Kepler Station, so this should be a quiet run." Voss climbed the ramp. "Try to keep it that way." Lisa led Jake through the ship's corridors. The Starlight Runner was bigger inside than she looked from the outside, with 3 cargo holds, crew quarters for 8 people, and a small medical bay. The corridors were clean but narrow, with exposed pipes and conduits running along the ceiling. "Engine room is down here," Lisa said, opening a heavy door. Main drive, backup systems, life support, and power distribution. Everything runs through this room. Jake stepped inside and immediately felt more comfortable. Engine rooms were the same everywhere, whether the ship was a luxury liner or a beat-up cargo hauler. The air smelled of ozone and lubricant. Control panels lined the walls, their displays showing the steady heartbeat of a healthy ship, but something was wrong. Jake couldn't put his finger on it at first. The readings all looked normal, but there was a feeling in the air, a vibration that didn't belong. He walked slowly around the room, letting his eyes adjust to the flashing lights and scrolling numbers. The plasma conduits are running a little hot, he said, pointing to a display panel. Lisa looked at the screen. Temperature is within normal range, green across the board. Normal range, yes. But they're running at the high end of normal. See this reading here? Jake tapped the screen. Yesterday it was probably 2 degrees cooler. The day before maybe 3 degrees cooler. How could you possibly know that? Lisa asked. Jake shrugged. Lucky guess? Mind if I take a look at the actual conduits? Lisa hesitated, then opened a maintenance panel. Inside, Jake could see the thick cables that carried superheated plasma from the main reactor to the drive systems. They glowed with a faint blue light, and the air around them shimmered with heat. Jake pulled a scanner from his tool belt and ran it along the conduit housing. The readings confirmed what his instincts had told him. The magnetic containment field was fluctuating by tiny amounts, causing the plasma to run hotter than it should. Field generators are wearing out, he said. Not dangerous yet, but in a few weeks you'd start seeing real problems. Power fluctuations, maybe even a containment breach if you push the engines too hard. The computer diagnostics show everything normal, Lisa said, but she was looking at his scanner readings with interest. Computers only know what their sensors tell them. Sometimes you have to look with your own eyes. Jake closed the maintenance panel. I can adjust the field strength tonight during the quiet shift. Won't take long. They finished the tour and Jake got settled into his quarters. The room was small but private, with a bunk, a desk, and a storage locker for his belongings. He had stayed in worse places. The launch went smoothly. Jake monitored the engine systems from the control room while Captain Voss guided them away from the station and into open space. The main drive engaged with a low rumble that Jake felt in his bones. They jumped to hyperspace without any problems. Once they were underway, Jake went back to the engine room to begin his work. Lisa was there ahead of him, running through the standard post-launch checklist. Everything looks good, she said. All systems nominal. Jake nodded and started his own inspection. He moved methodically through the room, checking readings, listening to the sounds the equipment made, and feeling for vibrations that shouldn't be there. It was something his father had taught him years ago. Machines had their own language if you knew how to listen. The coffee maker in the galley was making a grinding noise. Jake spent 20 minutes cleaning the internal mechanisms and adjusting the pressure settings. When he tested it, the machine produced a perfect cup in 3 minutes. Instead of the usual 10, the artificial gravity generators had a slight wobble that made the deck plates vibrate. Jake found a loose coupling in the primary stabilizer and tightened it. The vibration stopped. The air recycling system was working harder than it needed to. Jake discovered that 2 filters were installed backwards, making the fans work against increased resistance. He fixed that too. None of these were serious problems. The ship would have kept running with or without his repairs. But Jake had learned long ago that small problems became big problems if you ignored them long enough. By the end of his first shift, the Starlight Runner was running smoother than she had in months. The background hum of the engines was quieter and more even. The lights didn't flicker when the drive system cycled. Even the elevator moved more smoothly between decks. Pete Collins was the first to notice. Did you do something to the coffee maker? He asked Jake in the galley the next morning. Cleaned it a little, Jake replied, not looking up from his breakfast. It's working better than it has since I joined this crew, Pete said. He poured himself a cup and took a sip. Much better. Lisa mentioned the improved systems to Captain Voss during the daily briefing. Everything's running about 5% more efficiently than usual, she reported. Power consumption is down, temperature regulation is more stable, and the navigational computer is responding faster to course corrections. What did you do? Captain Voss asked Jake. Tightened a few bolts, Jake said. Routine maintenance stuff. But it was more than routine maintenance, and Jake knew it. He was doing what he always did, what had gotten him in trouble on the other ships. He was seeing problems that weren't quite problems yet, and fixing them before they became serious. He was reading the ship's systems like a book, understanding the story they told about wear and stress and the gradual breakdown that happened to all machines. The difference was that this time nothing had gone catastrophically wrong, yet, on the third day of the journey, Jake was running a diagnostic on the quantum field generators when he found something that made his blood run cold. The readings were all normal, well within acceptable parameters. But there was a pattern in the data that Jake recognized, a subtle signature that meant trouble was coming. He had seen it before, on all three of the ships that had made him famous for all the wrong reasons. Jake stared at the numbers on his screen and tried to convince himself that he was wrong. But the pattern was too clear, too familiar. Somewhere in the quantum field generators, a cascade failure was building. It might take days or weeks to develop, but when it hit, it would take down the main drive and leave them stranded in hyperspace. He could report it to Captain Voss, but who would believe him? The computer said everything was fine. Every diagnostic test came back green. Jake had no proof except his own instincts and a feeling in his gut that said disaster was coming. Instead, he decided to watch and wait. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe he was seeing patterns that weren't really there. Maybe his reputation as a jinx was making him paranoid. But Jake Martinez had learned to trust his instincts, even when everyone else said he was wrong. And his instincts were screaming that the Starlight Runner was in danger. Jake was in the engine room checking the plasma flow readings when the first alarm sounded. It was a soft beep, the kind that usually meant a minor system hiccup. He looked at the display panel and saw a yellow warning light next to the navigation. Computer. Probably nothing, he muttered, but something cold settled in his stomach. He had been watching the quantum field generators for 3 days, waiting for the pattern he recognized to complete itself. The generators were still showing normal readings, but Jake knew that could change in seconds. The second alarm was louder. Then the third. Within 30 seconds, the engine room was filled with flashing red lights and warning sounds that made Jake's ears ring. All hands to stations, Captain Voss's voice echoed through the ship's communication system. We have a navigation failure. I repeat, navigation failure. Jake felt the ship shudder as they dropped out of hyperspace. Through the small porthole in the engine room, he could see stars where there should have been the blue-white glow of hyperspace. They were in normal space, somewhere they weren't supposed to be. Lisa burst through the engine room door, her face pale with panic. The navigation computer just died, she said. Everything went red at once. Main drive is offline. Backup systems are struggling to maintain power. Jake was already moving, his hands dancing across the control panels as he tried to assess the damage. The quantum field generators were showing massive fluctuations. The plasma conduits were overloading. The main computer core was reporting errors faster than the display could keep up. Get Captain Voss down here, Jake said. Right now. Lisa spoke into her communicator while Jake continued his examination. The pattern he had been dreading was complete. The cascade failure had begun exactly as he had predicted, but it was worse than he had expected. Instead of just taking down the main drive, it was spreading through the ship's entire electrical system. Captain Voss arrived with Pete Collins close behind. Both of them looked grim. How bad is it? Voss asked. Bad, Jake replied without looking up from his console. The quantum field generators failed, which took down the navigation computer and the main drive. But the failure is spreading. We're losing power to non-essential systems, and if it keeps going, we'll lose life support too. How long do we have? Pete asked. Jake pulled up a star chart on his portable scanner. Their position showed as a small dot in empty space, surrounded by what looked like a dense asteroid field. The computer says we're drifting toward that asteroid field. At our current speed, we'll reach it in about 6 hours. Can we fix the engines? Captain Voss asked. Lisa was working at another console, trying to restart the quantum field generators. I can't get them to initialize, she said. The startup sequence keeps failing. It's like the computer doesn't remember how to turn them on. Jake continued checking systems, but the news kept getting worse. The communication array was completely dead. The backup engines could provide maneuvering power, but not enough to escape the gravity well that was pulling them toward the asteroids. Even the escape pods wouldn't help because they didn't have the range to reach the nearest shipping lane. I need to see the whole crew, Captain Voss said. Emergency meeting in the galley in 5 minutes. The crew gathered around the small table. In the ship's galley, Krex and Chitara sat close together, their alien faces unreadable. Pete looked angry, the way people do when they're scared but don't want to admit it. Lisa kept checking her tablet as if the numbers might change if she looked at them enough times. Here's the situation, Captain Voss began. We're stranded in an unknown sector with no engines, no communications, and no way to call for help. We're drifting toward an asteroid field, and we have 6 hours before we reach it. What about the escape pods? Chitara asked in her musical voice. Not enough range, Pete replied. The nearest shipping lane is 12 hours away. The pods only have life support for 8 hours. Can we repair the main engines? Krex asked, his deep voice rumbling through the small room. Lisa shook her head. The quantum field generators are completely fried. Even if we had replacement parts, which we don't, it would take days to rebuild them. Jake listened to the discussion but didn't participate. He was thinking about the cascade failure, trying to understand why it had spread so far beyond what he had predicted. The pattern had been clear, but the scale was wrong. Something else was happening, something he was missing. What about you, Martinez? Captain Voss asked. Any ideas? All eyes turned to Jake. He could see the suspicion in their faces, the same. Look, he had gotten on the other ships when things went wrong. They were already starting to blame him, even though the failure had nothing to do with his work. I need to examine the damage more carefully, Jake said. Maybe there's something we can do. Like what? Pete asked. You heard Lisa? The generators are dead? Jake stood up from the table. Give me 2 hours. Let me see what I'm working with. After the meeting broke up, Jake went back to the engine room. But instead of looking at the quantum field generators, he started tracing power cables and data. Connections. The cascade failure had followed the ship's electrical pathways, jumping from system to system like a virus. He opened maintenance panels he had never looked at before, following cables through the walls and under the deck plates. The ship's electrical system was more complex than he had realized, with redundant pathways and backup connections that weren't shown on the standard schematics. An hour into his investigation, Jake found what he was looking for, hidden behind. A panel in the cargo bay was a junction box that connected the quantum field generators to the navigation computer. Someone had installed a feedback loop, a piece of hardware that wasn't supposed to be there. Jake stared at the device for a long time, understanding finally dawning on him. This wasn't a random failure. The cascade had been deliberately triggered. By this hidden device, someone had sabotaged the Starlight Runner, just like someone had sabotaged the other 3 ships he had worked on, but understanding the cause didn't solve their immediate problem. They were still drifting toward the asteroid field with no engines and no way to call for help. The sabotage device had done its work too well. Even removing it wouldn't bring the dead systems back to life. Jake pulled out his scanner and began mapping every electrical connection in the ship. If the normal systems were dead, maybe he could build new ones. It was crazy, but he had done crazy things before. The ship's entertainment system was still working. So were the galley appliances and the lighting in the crew quarters. The sabotage had targeted specific systems while leaving others intact. That gave Jake an idea, a desperate plan that might work if he could convince the crew to trust him. He looked at his watch. 4 hours until they reached the asteroid field. 4 hours to rebuild a starship using coffee makers and video screens. Jake smiled grimly and reached for his tools. He had work to do. Lisa found him 2 hours later, surrounded by cables and electronic components. He had torn apart half the galley and removed panels from 3 different corridors. The deck was covered with parts that seemed to have no connection to each other. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Building a new ship," Jake replied, not looking up from his work. "The old one is broken, so I'm making a new one." Lisa looked at the chaos around him. "That's impossible. You can't rebuild a starship with kitchen appliances." Jake connected 2 cables and checked the reading on his scanner. "Watch me." Jake worked in silence while the rest of the crew argued in the galley above him. He had pulled apart the entertainment system, the coffee maker, 2 wall displays, and the automatic food dispenser. Now he was connecting them together with cables that weren't designed to carry the loads he was putting through them. "This is insane," Lisa said, watching him splice a power cable from the galley microwave into the ship's backup navigation system. "You're going to electrocute yourself." "Probably," Jake agreed, but he didn't stop working. He had found a way to bypass the dead quantum field generators by routing power through the entertainment system's processors. It was like performing surgery with kitchen knives, but it might work. Captain Voss came down to check on his progress. She looked at the mess of cables and components spread across the deck. "How much time do we have left?" 2 hours, Jake replied, connecting the ship's gaming computer to what used to be the main navigation display. "Maybe less." "And you think this will work?" Jake paused in his work and looked up at her. "Captain, I've been sabotaged 3 times before. Each time, the same kind of cascade failure. Each time, I had to rebuild the ship from scratch using whatever I could find." He held up a circuit board from the coffee maker. "I've gotten good at improvising sabotaged?" Captain Voss stared at him. "What do you mean?" Jake showed her the device he had found in the cargo bay junction box. "Someone planted this on your ship. It's designed to trigger a cascade failure in the quantum field. Generators. I found similar devices on the other 3 ships I worked on." "Who would do something like this?" "Someone who wanted those ships to fail," Jake said. "Someone who benefited when cargo deliveries were late or captains lost money." He went back to his work, rewiring the ship's environmental controls through the food replicator's power supply. "I never figured out who it was. I was too busy trying to keep people alive." Pete Collins appeared at the bottom of the ladder. "The asteroid field is getting closer. We can see it through the bridge windows now. Looks like a wall of rock." Jake nodded but kept working. He had rigged a new navigation system using the entertainment computer's graphics processors. It wouldn't be as accurate as the original, but it might be enough to plot a course away from the asteroids. The hard part was getting the engines to work. The main drive was completely dead, but Jake had found another way. He was routing power from the life support systems through the ship's lighting circuits and into the backup thrusters. It was dangerous and inefficient, but it might give them enough thrust to change their trajectory. "Help me move this," Jake said to Lisa, pointing to a heavy power conduit. Together they lifted it and connected it to a junction box that Jake had rewired using parts from the automatic laundry system. "I don't understand how this is supposed to work," Lisa said. "The quantum field generators created a controlled space-time distortion that allowed faster-than-light travel," Jake explained as he worked. "But that's not the only way to make a ship move. We just need thrust, and thrust is just energy applied in the right direction." He had connected the ship's water recycling pumps to the thruster control systems. The pumps were designed to move liquids under pressure, but Jake had modified them to regulate the flow of plasma to the backup engines. It was crude, but it might work. Krex and Chitara joined them in the engine room. The aliens watched Jake work with growing amazement. They had never seen anyone rebuild a starship's systems using household appliances. "This goes against everything I learned in engineering school," Chitara said in her musical voice. "Engineering school teaches you to use the right tool for the job," Jake replied, connecting the ship's communication system to the thruster controls. But sometimes you don't have the right tool. Sometimes you have to make the right tool out of the wrong tools. The cascade failure was designed to target specific systems, Krex observed. Whoever planted that device knew exactly how to disable a ship without destroying it completely. Jake looked up at the big Saurian. Smart observation. They wanted the ships disabled, not destroyed. Dead crews don't talk, but stranded crews can be rescued and questioned. He connected another cable. The saboteur needed the failures to look like accidents. But why target you specifically? Captain Voss asked. I don't think they did, Jake said. I think they targeted independent cargo ships, and I just happened to be working on them when the device is activated. Bad timing on my part. He stood up and checked his work. The jury-rig systems looked like something a madman would build, but all the connections were solid. Power was flowing through pathways that had never been designed to carry it. The ship's entertainment computer was now running navigation calculations, while the coffee maker's heating elements were regulating thruster pressure. This is either going to work perfectly or kill us all, Jake announced. How can you be sure it will work? Pete asked. Jake smiled grimly. Because I've done this before, 3 times. Each time I had to rebuild a ship using whatever wasn't destroyed. By the sabotage, each time the crews thought I was crazy. Each time it worked. He moved to the main control panel and began the startup sequence. The displays flickered as power flowed through his improvised connections. Warning lights flashed as systems that were never meant to work together tried to communicate with each other. Backup thrusters online, Jake announced. Navigation computer? Responding, power level stable, he looked at Captain Voss. We're not going to win any speed records, but we can move. Through the ship's porthole, they could see the asteroid field growing larger. Individual rocks were visible now, tumbling slowly through space like deadly mountains. The largest ones were big enough to swallow the Starlight Runner without a trace. Jake engaged the thrusters. The ship shuddered as the backup engines fired, pushing them away from their collision course. It wasn't much thrust, barely enough to feel, but it was changing their direction. It's working, Lisa whispered, staring at the navigation display. We're actually moving away from the asteroids. The improvised systems held together as Jake carefully adjusted their course. The entertainment computer calculated a path through the sparse region between asteroid clusters. The coffee maker's pressure systems kept the thruster output steady. The ship's lighting circuits carried more power than they were designed for. But they didn't fail. How did you know this would work? Captain Voss asked. Because machines are simpler than people think, Jake replied, monitoring his jury-rig systems. A thruster doesn't care if its control signals come from a military-grade computer or a gaming console. It just needs the right voltage at the right time. A power conduit doesn't care if it's carrying electricity from a fusion reactor or a microwave oven. Electricity is electricity? Pete was staring at the navigation display in amazement. You rebuilt our entire propulsion system using kitchen appliances and entertainment equipment. Not rebuilt, Jake corrected. Replaced, the old systems were. Designed by committee with safety margins and redundant backups and standardized interfaces, my system is simpler. 1 input, 1 output, no unnecessary complexity. The asteroid field slowly fell behind them as Jake's improvised engines pushed. The Starlight Runner toured the shipping lanes. They were moving slowly, but they were moving in the right direction. In 12 hours, they would reach an area where other ships traveled regularly. You said you've done this before, Captain Voss said. On all 3 ships that gave you your reputation, Jake nodded. Same sabotage device, same cascade failure, same desperate repairs. Each time I managed to get the ship moving again using whatever wasn't destroyed. Each time the crews made it to safety. He adjusted the thruster. Output slightly. Each time, everyone said it was my fault that the ship broke down in the first place. But you saved them, Chitara pointed out. I saved them with solutions that looked impossible, Jake replied. People don't trust things they don't understand. It was easier to blame me for bringing bad luck than to accept that someone was deliberately sabotaging ships. The improvised systems continued to function as they limped toward the shipping lanes. Jake's crazy combination of household appliances and starship components was actually working, pulling them away from certain death and toward the possibility of rescue. For the first time in months, Jake Martinez allowed himself to hope that his reputation might finally change. The rescue ship found them 18 hours later, drifting slowly through the shipping lanes with engines that should not have existed. Captain Rex Torres of the heavy cruiser Defender stared at his scanner readings in disbelief. "Are you sure those readings are correct?" he asked his sensor operator. "Confirmed, sir. The merchant vessel Starlight Runner is running on what appears to be a propulsion system built from entertainment equipment and kitchen appliances." The young officer looked up from his console. "I've never seen anything like it." Captain Torres opened a communication channel. "Starlight Runner, this is Captain Torres of the Defender. Do you require assistance?" Captain Voss's voice came through clearly. "Defender, this is Captain Voss. We've had some engine trouble, but we're operational. We could use a tow to the nearest repair station." "Copy that, Starlight Runner. We're moving to intercept." Torres paused. "Captain, our sensors are showing some unusual readings from your propulsion systems. Is everything all right over there?" "Everything is fine, Defender. We had to make some temporary repairs." Temporary repairs, Torres thought. His engineering officer was already studying the scanner data, trying to understand how a ship could possibly run on the energy signature they were detecting. 3 hours later, the Defender had the Starlight Runner in tow and was heading for Newton Station. Captain Torres decided to visit the smaller ship personally. What he found in the engine room left him speechless. Jake was monitoring his improvised systems when the rescue captain arrived. The engine room looked like a disaster area, with cables running in every direction and components that clearly didn't belong connected to systems they were never meant to control. "You built this?" Torres asked, staring at the coffee maker that was somehow regulating thruster pressure. "Had to," Jake replied simply. "The regular engines were sabotaged." Torres examined the connections more closely. His own engineering background was extensive, but he couldn't understand how half of these systems were functioning. This should be impossible. The power requirements alone should have overloaded every circuit in the ship. "It's all about efficiency," Jake explained. "Standard ship systems are over-engineered for safety. They use 10 times more power than they actually need. Strip away the safety margins and redundant systems, and you can run a ship on a fraction of the normal power." Captain Voss joined them in the engine room. "Martinez saved all our lives," she told Torres. "Without his modifications, we would have been smashed to pieces in that asteroid field." "How long have you been working on ships?" Torres asked Jake. "About 5 years, most of that time unemployed." Jake adjusted a connection between the ship's lighting system and the navigation computer. "I have a reputation for bringing bad luck." Torres looked around the engine room again. The improvised systems were still running smoothly after 20 hours of operation. Whatever Jake had built, it was stable and reliable. "I've been a ship captain for 15 years, Torres said slowly. "I've seen a lot of creative engineering, but nothing like this. You didn't just repair your ship, you redesigned it." When they reached Newton Station, word of the Starlight Runner's unusual repairs had already spread. The station's chief engineer, a woman named Carol Martinez, was waiting at the dock with a team of specialists. "I want to see everything," she told Jake as soon as he stepped off the ship. "Every connection, every modification, every component you used. This is the most innovative engineering I've ever heard of." Jake spent the next 2 days explaining his work to crowds of fascinated engineers and ship captains. They took detailed scans of his modifications, asked hundreds of questions, and tested his improvised systems under every condition they could think of. "The efficiency gains are incredible," Carol Martinez announced after completing her analysis. "Your modifications use 60% less power than standard systems while maintaining the same performance levels. Some of your solutions are actually better than the original designs." Pete Collins found Jake in the station cantina on the third evening. The first officer sat down across from him with 2 beers. "I owe you an apology," Pete said. "When you first came aboard, I thought you were trouble. I was wrong." "Most people think that," Jake replied. "I'm used to it." "But you saved us anyway. Even knowing we didn't trust you, you worked around the clock to keep us alive." Pete took a drink of his beer. "That says something about your character." Lisa Murphy appeared at their table, carrying a datapad filled with technical specifications. "I've been studying your modifications," she told Jake. "I think I understand about half of them. The other half still look like magic to me." "Not magic," Jake said. "Just different thinking. Engineering school teaches you to follow the rules, use approved components, stay within safety margins. But sometimes the rules don't help. Sometimes you have to throw out everything you learned and start over." Krex and Chitara joined them at the table. The aliens had been particularly interested in Jake's work, comparing it to engineering techniques from their own species. "Among my people, we have a saying," Krex rumbled. "The river that flows around the rock reaches the sea faster than the river that tries to move the rock." "Humans seem to specialize in flowing around rocks," Chitara added. "Your species finds solutions that others would never consider." Captain Voss was the last to arrive. She sat down and looked directly at Jake. "I've got an offer for you. Chief engineer position, full pay plus bonuses, and a share of the profits from any cargo runs we complete. The Starlight Runner is yours to modify however you see fit." Jake was tempted, but he shook his head. "Thank you, but I think I'm going to try something different." "Different how?" Voss asked Dot before Jake could answer. His communicator chimed with an incoming message, then another. Then a dozen more. He looked at the display and saw job offers from ship captains across the sector. "Word travels fast," Pete observed. Jake scrolled through the messages. Cargo haulers, passenger liners, even military contractors were offering him positions. The pay rates were double or triple what he had ever made before. "The broken mechanic who stopped a ship from yeeting into Oblivion," Lisa read from a news article on her tablet. "That's what they're calling you now." "Better than Jinx Jake," Jake admitted. Captain Torres appeared at their table, still wearing his military uniform. "Martinez, I've got a proposition for you. The Navy is starting a new program for unconventional engineering solutions. We need someone who can think outside the box when standard procedures fail." "What kind of work?" Jake asked. "Problem solving. We give you broken ships that nobody else can fix, and you work your magic on them." Torres leaned forward. "Full military. Rank, unlimited budget for parts and equipment, and your own research team." Jake considered the offer. It sounded interesting, but he had spent too many years working for other people. "I appreciate the offer, Captain, but I think it's time I went into business for myself." "Business doing what?" Captain Voss asked, and Jake smiled. "Fixing the unfixable. There are a lot of ships out there with problems that can't be solved with standard parts and procedures. Maybe it's time someone offered them a different kind of solution." He stood up from the table and raised his beer. "To thinking differently." The others joined the toast. As Jake looked around the table at the people who had started as strangers and were now friends, he realized that his reputation as a jinx had finally been replaced by something better. He was Jake Martinez, the mechanic, who could fix anything with whatever he had on hand. The man who turned disasters into triumphs using coffee makers and gaming computers. And for the first time in years, he was exactly where he wanted to be. 3 months later, Jake opened his own repair shop on the outer rim of Newton Station. The sign over the door read, "Impossible Engineering, no problem too weird." Ships lined up outside his bay, waiting for solutions that nobody else could provide. Jake Martinez had finally found his place in the universe. And the universe was a better place for it.